His name is Luc Hamzavi. He is a teacher of history and TOK guidance counselor at the International School of Geneva. Mr. Hamzavi is a bilingual university guidance specialist with over 25 years experience and knowledge of university systems worldwide. He is interested in the development of an intelligent school, especially at high school level. Experienced TOK teacher and workshop leader for the International Baccalaureate, as well as French IB history teacher, Mr. Hamzavi is interested in the teaching of human rights and political science at high school level. So let's welcome him.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Good. So I'm going to disappear for a while presenting, and then hope to see you back in a moment and have not lost most of you in the meantime. So it's going to be an interesting, well, it is an interesting challenge to prepare this presentation for you. And I feel very honored to be there. The presentation, I'll be introducing basically a few things about history in general, then about critical thinking and how the two, in fact, must be combined and combined naturally. And then how this can be used and what impact can have when teaching about African history or in Africa. There will be a few resources, probably a bit more in the chat if necessary. And I tried to be, the first part is a bit theoretical, the second part is more practical on my own take on things as a teacher myself. So since we don't have that much time, I will start anyway. The basic thing is, when we say we teach history, the question is, what history do we teach? History can be used as a tool for memory, can be used as a tool to build up a sense of community, or history can be thought as a discipline per se. So the first question here is, in what situation are all of us as teachers when we have to do it? The point is also that if we go for the second option, history is an autonomous discipline. If we go for the first option, history, of course, can be constrained by authorities, by culture, by a number of elements. So that's the first step, is questioning ourselves, what history are we teaching? The second thing is, when we teach history, and we think of history in general, there are two different schools of thought, if you want. There's a classical one that we could call realist, and there's a more modern one we could call relativist. In the old realist school, there is something that is objective. So in the old classic approach, there is an objective history somewhere that can be found, and you can tell history. In the more recent approach, the more relativist approach, the idea is that whatever you say, whatever statement is always coming from the perspective of one person. So there's no absolute truth, there's no objective truth, there's no objective history. This is, for instance, the perspective that in a way Foucault had when he said that you cannot look at past history objectively because it was written by those who were in power at that time. So that's another question we have to raise every time we think of history and teaching history. In what situation are we, and what are our own beliefs? Because obviously the beliefs of the teacher will have an impact on the way they will teach and how they can see things. Now, critical thinking. Of course, critical thinking, we can go back to Socrates and the Socratic method. Now, some thinkers over time have looked at it and added some critics or some comments, like for instance, Bacon, who had identified the 4 idols that block us, that prevent us from using critical thinking. You have also Rousseau. Rousseau stated that critical thinking, in order to be efficient in terms of education, has to be pitched to the level of your audience. Or you have Russell, who questions the importance of our own biases. Because in the end, what is critical thinking? And that's where you have a first issue. There's no clear, unique definition of what critical thinking is. So in the presentation, I have indicated a number. They go from the shortest one to the longest one. The shortest one is one by Dewey, who says, critical thinking is the accurate and deliberate instituting of connections between what is done and its consequences. So, and he says it's a process, the goal of which is to make reasonable decisions about what to believe and what to do. And then you have Paul, Elder, and Bartle. It's the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, synthesizing, evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. I'm tempted to say that it also embodies a number of intellectual standards that could be clarity, accuracy, precision, fairness, all these elements, relevance should be present. When you get the presentation, because I won't read the whole text, I have two longer texts, one by Glaser, 1941, and one comes from the Delphi report, that are full definitions of what critical thinking is about. And so I'll leave you to the pleasures of reading at a later moment. For many people also, critical thinking is something essential if you look at something like Bloom's taxonomy, because the whole idea here is that you have to aim for higher order thinking. And of course, in education, it's also the kind of questions you're going to ask, and how you set up your assessment, for instance, or you set up your whole course will relate on this. And the idea is try and follow this pattern that goes from basic knowledge to, in the end, evaluation and application and creation, depending on what you intend to do. So what's interesting is when history meets critical thinking. Critical thinking, for me at least, is essential to allow students to think in an autonomous manner. And is essential to allow for a learning experience that's based on active participation and problem solving. So it's not the teacher lecturing, it's the students discovering. And the intersection really takes place in one specific point, which is interesting because in history, you are self-conscious. The historiography is part of the discipline of the historian, and it's where you should apply at every stage of your work a self-conscious self-critique. And critical thinking is also about a self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective attitude. So it's really between you and your knowledge. And so they intersect in one point, the sources. Because the facts are something, it's happened or it didn't happen, or you were there, you were not there. The sources are what are used to build history. Whatever history you choose to build, whether it's a history that has that aims at strengthening memory, or whether it's a critical history, you always need sources. And if we want students to be autonomous thinkers, and I would say autonomous historians, then we have to empower them to use sources. That's the key element. That's when they become really able to work things on their own. And also, we provide them with tools that they can use in other subjects and in life in general. So when it comes to teaching history and looking at the perspective that's more conceptual than just a chronology, you have different models. Here you have, for instance, the IBO model, where you have change, continuity, causation, consequence, significance, perspective. Here is a model from an Oxford University Press textbook in history that has perspective, continuity and change, cause and effect, evidence, empathy, significance, contestability. And it could go on and go on. And there's one word that comes out that can be singled out, it's significance. That's where, as teachers, we have to pay very much attention, because that's where also as historian, we would pay attention. When discussing sources here, the key concept is significance, because as a historian, for instance, this is what will guide me in selecting one source over another. And this is what will help us assign the place of a document or whatever in a research or in a teaching. That's the central piece. So how do we assess this significance? A first good example are Council's 5 R's. remarkable. The event was remarked upon by people at the time and or since. Remembered, the event or development was important at some stage in history. Resonance, people like to make analogies with it. Resulting in change, had consequences for the future. And reveals some other aspect of the past. Another one that's interesting is Lévesque. Lévesque is from Quebec, and he's written interesting things about thinking critically in history and teaching history critically. And for him, the first 5 criteria are importance. Was it considered important by those who lived it? Profundity, how deeply people were affected by the event. And the fact that he refers to people is important. Quantity, number of people affected. Also, he warns here that it may not be the key element. Durability, how long people were affected. And relevance, extent to which it helps understand the present. And Lévesque has extended these 5 points, to 3 more points. Intimate interests, symbolic lessons, and contemporary lessons. Intimate interests is, for instance, if as a student, what you're studying has had an impact on you or your family. How do you deal with that? And also how it has an impact on what you're gonna do. Symbolic lessons, that's quite obvious. It's something that has such an image now that it is a point of reference. And contemporary lessons, can you relate what you study with the present world, with what's happening now? And I like these 8 elements. And on the previous slide, at the bottom, there is a link to a document that is called Doing History that shows how this can be implemented in a classroom. Then if you really focus on the notion of source analysis, a very interesting author for me is Weinberg. Weinberg has written that if you want to do source analysis, the first thing you have to consider is sourcing. Okay, where does the document come from? The second thing is contextualization, which means who wrote it, in what context, in what circumstances. Then reading like a historian, which means understanding the subtext. And for this, there's a very good introduction at Stanford University. And again, here you have the link. And you have some sample lessons that you can use, and it's free. And you have a great number of lessons that are very interesting on how to do that. And then corroboration, the fact that a source is meaningful only if it can be confirmed by other sources. One source on its own has really not much value. So if you try to think of that and apply it to the context of African history, I see from the outside, I must confess, a number of challenges. The first one is that Africa, as we know, was long denied its history, notably by European historians, and also, for instance, by French President Mr. Sarkozy in 2007, when he said that the African men had not entered history yet. What's interesting in the case of history is that there was an excuse to this. Beyond all prejudices and all cultural dimensions, there was this idea that there cannot be history without written sources. And besides, next to this was sitting the idea that, and of course, there are no written sources in Africa. Luckily, the discipline has evolved and has learned to recognize now the value of oral history. And if you look at, for instance, there's now, in 2019, a new professor in charge in the Collège de France of history, African history and archaeology. And his assessment of oral history is that some witnesses that have only oral testimonies, in fact, have better information than written documents. And at the same time, research has also demonstrated that there is more written history in Africa than we think, or than we used to think. But the thing is, this is not for the whole continent. There are areas where it's more dense than others. And also, in some cases, it's in languages that were already deemed by Europeans inferior. So you have, for instance, correspondence that was written in Arabic. And so, or so you have a situation where basically there was a material way to exclude Africa by saying, well, they have not written anything, they are not part of history. So one of the challenges for a history teacher, I think, is to identify enough sources that are African sources. So maybe there's a work that has to be done here by the teacher that has to teach African history to work with, for instance, oral sources and learn to work with them. And I'm going to come to that at a later stage. A second challenge I see again from the outside is that as there are more ways to teach history, there's more than one Africa. So you have to understand, you have to accept the fact that there are potential clashes. That, for instance, as I said at the beginning, a history project in education can be something where the discipline of history is at the center, or can be something that is in fact related to a political project. So here you have to see how you can balance the two. And at the same time, there's also the fact that history is also not only a discipline in theory, it's also the life of people. So whenever you discuss anything that has to do with ethnicities, with borders, you touch on the very sensitive issues. And even in Europe, where there has been enormous efforts for reconciliation after World War II, even today, we are unable to write a common Franco-German history book, textbook. It doesn't exist. And they keep disagreeing. And when you try to produce one, there's so many criticisms from all sides that it just vanishes. It's like it never happened. So that's also something that I think can be very sensitive. And it's also one of the challenges because there is now this desire to put Africa forward. And so there's a contradiction, there's a tension between these two dimensions. Finally, African history today is at the center of a revolution that's hitting history. We have new imperial history, we have post-colonial studies, we have subaltern studies, we have the decolonization of the curriculum. All these elements are fascinating. Sometimes, at the same time, they're contradicting each other. And for a researcher, it's fascinating. But for a teacher, the teachers very often feel the need of some kind of safe environment and some safe information. And the whole thing is now crumbling down because you have competitive analysis sometimes that disagree on fundamental elements. So what's important there is that those who practice critical thinking, and here I would say students as well as teachers, will be comfortable with the fact that there's no absolute answer. Because if there's one lesson to learn from critical thinking, one lesson to learn from Socrates, and I see that Conrad is there, and Conrad has often noted how much I love using the Socratic method in my own teaching, is the fact that there is no absolute answer. If you keep looking for it, you're done. And my last slide is a bit illegible, and I apologize for that. I was looking for examples of things on how to help a teacher who would read this presentation and would say, okay, what's in the presentation is interesting, but how do you try and do something about oral history or things like that? And I found a resource in Canada. And these are documents that you have the website, and these are documents that you can access freely. And I've bolded 4 of these documents because I think they are very significant. One is, of course, explaining the significance of historical events. One is identifying important voices. And it's a project in local history. But I think the kind of approach is something that can be used in a context where you have local history, where you have things that are not always set in stone, where you have to go to people, you have to find the right interlocutor. And that's the next point, listening and learning from elders. And finally, paying attention to emotions when learning. And that's something that Lévesque is touching upon. And he raises 2 questions. The first one is, how much should we care for our emotions? How much should we accept emotions when discussing history? And something that's related to that, and it's again a very contemporary issue, something that could be at the center of the discussion in a way. And that is, should we have an ethical assessment of historical situation? How far can we go in discussing the moral ethics of somebody who lived in a different time, in a different place. And okay, if you're in Europe now, that is of course an echo of discussion about statues. Should we have the statue of this guy or that guy? But it goes beyond that. It's a really deep questioning because it changes your approach to history. Okay, that's all I had to say using the slides. So now I'm open to questions or comments.
I think the question was in general, where are the best archives, I guess, to work on African history?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, the best archives to work on African history, you have a few interesting solutions in France, where you have things like the Collège de France, for instance, that give you indirectly access to a number of sources. Otherwise, I would say UK universities are probably one of the best sources, and specific programs in the US. I can prepare a list of places. These are really the three directions. Universities, in fact, will have usually the best resources for that kind of request.
Are the sources as good? Do we have as good sources, both written and visual, or is there one more dominant and easy to find than the other?
Well, it depends really what you are looking for, but very often for some topics, it's going to be more visual sources. For others, it's going to be paper sources. For instance, if you're looking for sources on, let's say, forced labor in Congo in the 1890s, you'll have more, that's where you're going to have lots of visual sources. If you're looking for something like the situation in 1965 in Ghana, you have more written sources. So there's not one rule really. It depends on the situation, but basically you tend to have in the end more written sources.
Thank you. Again, I'll let you get the other question.
Okay, Elena Mora wrote, thanks for bringing up the connection between history and critical thinking. I guess you have put this into practice in your lessons as TOK and IB experts. I would like to ask you if you feel there is a need in the current IB curriculum to decolonize some elements of it. I have taught TOK for 15 years in IB school, and I've realized that it is a great to focus on the skill of critical thinking, since there is a room choosing sources, topics, and units of study quite freely.
So TOK, I will say.
So, and the questions still go on. Do you want me to read the whole question before you answer?
As you wish.
Okay.
Go on for, yeah.
However, what about the contents in the other subjects? Are they wide enough to provide different perspectives? Do you believe that the role of a teacher is an essential one in selecting contents and sources to avoid an Eurocentric approach to the IB curriculum or to any other curriculum for the matter? Elena.
So definitely in the case of the IB, the theory of knowledge is not that Eurocentered because it's very open and you can really create your own course. But history is a very good example of a curriculum that is centered in the sense that when you teach history for the IB, and I think that especially for those who don't know what how the IB functions, you have two levels, standard level and higher level. So higher level is where you go in depth in subjects. And this works with a geographical division. That means that if you are aiming to teach your students in the 2 years of the IB program, the special part on Europe, you will build up your curriculum down below to focus on Europe too. And so if you don't have that much time, it depends on how many periods you have available to do it. Of course, what's going to happen is you're going to discard the rest of the world because you want students to have the right foundation, if I might say so. So the nature of the IB curriculum forces you in a direction and has an impact on what's happening down below that is negative, that would require, yes, very strong decolonization. In other subjects, you may face the same problem. So there are attempts, and luckily the IB gives you some freedom, but basically, I'm not aware of any curriculum that doesn't have this kind of bias. And there's really work to be done there. but it's also a question of how much time you give to history. Because in many systems, you don't have an allocation that gives you the opportunity to do everything. And it's also, again, a question of approach to history. If you have a conceptual approach to history, when you think your students are going to learn to use some tools and think by themselves, it gives you more freedom. If, on the other hand, you're convinced that you have to cover some material and you have to make sure that they know when was the Battle of Marignan, that's something else. So the attitude of the teacher will have a major impact on what they can do or not with their own curriculum and how much freedom they give themselves, in fact, to prepare something for the next stage, even if the end curriculum remains to be decolonized.
I have Jeremy Pounds Hoover. My mother talks about how when she was doing her PhD in the 17th, historians didn't consider popular history, all right, but that this was a big revolution at that time. I wonder if that is where we need to be more comfortable as historians. In my classes, I use a lot of work by journalists, videos, etc., to teach African history in an attempt to hear more voices than from classical African history.
It's one of the key evolutions of history, and it's an evolution of history as a subject, as a discipline, that has maybe not always been translated into history in the classroom for a number of reasons. For a very long time, and that's part of the criticism, history has been the history of dominant groups. And that's why now you have women contesting, you have people from other areas of the world, you have minorities, you have people saying the history that we were taught, this history that was in the books up until, let's say, the late 90s, mostly, was the history of the rich, was the history of those who could afford to have written traces left, the history of those who were not perceived as invisible, and women were invisible, Black people in Europe were invisible, etc., etc. So yes, we should definitely use other sources. We should resort to are the components of history. And that's why I stress the importance of sources. You can use any document if you can approach it with the right tools. There's no element, no piece of information that you could say is not history. That's why I love history myself. It's because everything around me is history or can be history. And so I can use everything, and all I have to do is when I do it in a proper, intelligent way. And I think critical thinking is the right way to do it. Hope it answered the question.
Estelle?
Oh, yeah, of course you answered the question brilliantly. I just wanted to say that what you were talking about right now reminded me of a conversation that we had this morning about writing African history for the consumption of African people, and how it was important that we don't only focus on sources that were created in Africa, even though we need to develop that side of things as well. But all sources, everything is history. Everything can tell us about a posture, about a mindset of a certain time or a certain place. And I like the fact that history is by nature inclusive. And I want to ask you a kind of a more personal question. If you had to choose an African option to teach in the IB, which one would you favor and why?
What do you call an African option?
I guess I'm not a history teacher. So for example, which regions would you like to teach, or which topic would you use the African context to explore?
It's a very tough question because I have a number of ideas that spring to my mind. The first one, something that, okay, probably because of my own origins. I mean, I'm half Italian, half Iranian, and so I have connections to the Middle East and the national and the world of Islam. So probably one of my areas of interest would be how Islam has impacted Africa. That would be probably my first point. Otherwise, I'm fascinated by one thing also. I mentioned the fact that for European historians, there was no history of Africa because there was no written sources. Something also that has contributed to erasing the history of Africa is the lack of borders. I would like to turn to a history of geography specialist and study the notion of border, of limits in the African world. Because in Europe, we have one colleague at Decolonization who's a specialist of borders. And he has walked around the canton of Geneva and taken pictures of every milestone that is at the border, showing the border between Switzerland and France. And he's written a book about it, and it's fascinating. And you don't have that in Africa. We have here a Roman legacy. And so that's something I would find fascinating. How do you work on limits? How do you work on borders? How do you work on these areas of fusion and interaction in Africa? These were the first two ideas that come to my mind.
These are indeed fantastic questions, obviously, because when we know how the African borders were created and the impact that it has on politics today, it's really interesting to compare it to older borders that maybe take more into account the division of ethnicity and groups than what is happening in Africa, definitely. I don't know if Ariane wants to read what Claire has said about the empires, the pre-colonial empires. Claire McMinn, if you can find it. Yeah, I think Claire said something about how exciting it is to teach something really positive about Africa. And I think that is where I would like to share maybe my children's perspectives about learning African history at school. One day my son comes home and he says, oh, I'm so tired of always learning about poverty, about problems, about wars, even if people are telling us about the resilience of Africans. Can't we just have the same problems as everyone else? And I thought, okay, that's really interesting. And this really shows that you can actually take a positive angle on the people on a history, but history is often essentially, and I wonder it's even worse for Africa, but it's a general feature of history I find. It's often bad news. Can you do a history of positive news to kind of support the identical quests of my African children? Is it something that you can even do?
Yes.
How would you go about this, Luc? About counterbalancing deficit narratives?
I think that there's one thing. In a way, I'm tempted to say a good teacher has to remain a child. And child have an ability to find things marvelous. And if you look at, I don't know of any area in the world, I don't know of any era in history where there are no things you can wonder about and feel, wow, that's extraordinary. So it's easy, I think, to identify what is positive in the sense that there's always something. Now, what may be a bit more difficult when you're in just the teaching environment is because, again, as I said, teachers like to have answers. Teachers like to have something solid. Teachers like to have something that is referenced. And maybe sometimes what you find amazing somewhere is not referenced. Maybe it's not something that can be quantified. That, for instance, just, well, to expand from this, it's just a parenthesis. The history of Africa became invisible because of what I said about the written dimension. Then it became it could have become a bit more visible. But one of the main changes in the practice of history in the 20s was the French École des Annales. The École des Annales was great because you have one book called Montaillou Village Occitan that for the first time tells you the story of one tiny village with no interest, historically speaking, but where all the documents from the church were were found. So you could detail exactly what happened day after day in, I think it's 1312, something like that. Anyway, so you have that, you had that dimension, but at some point it became quantitative. You had to be able to assess things in terms of quantities. And Africa disappeared again because you don't have numbers. And numbers in the Western vision became essential because it made history more scientific. Just like you have the idea in political science that you could put things in equation, you could put the human reasoning in equation. So, and I think that something is changing now because of precisely the new alternative visions to history, because of postcolonial studies. You no longer need numbers, you no longer need that quantitative dimension, but it's maybe something that still needs to reach the teachers. So as long as teachers are looking for something solid with numbers, with references, they have a hard time finding something positive. If they forget that, if they put themselves again in the shoes of kids, they will find something positive because there's always something to marvel to. It could be something about art, and art is part of history. It could be a human experience, and human beings are history. It could be a piece of literature. It could be anything. So there's always something positive, even if in the end, you may have to tell the story of, look at something, the way you can look at things. World War II, the Shoah. And you can teach entirely using archive footage of camps, and it's awful. Or you can read Anne Frank's diaries, and it's your emotions that will speak. And it's hard to say that it's beautiful, but it's not the kind of horror. It's not that negative thing. It's a young girl who writes about hope. So you can, even in the worst circumstances, you can find something positive to work on if you want to. At least that's my conviction.
Yeah. Ariane, you want to say something or?
Yeah, I had a question. I'm not sure my question is like, but I wanted to know if you could, if economic reasons could explain the scarcity of professorships in important universities like University of Geneva, because I went here in 2011, and I found that there was no professorships around African literature, and I was like, why? Why? University of Geneva is like a huge university in the world, and there is no. What do you think about that?
I think it's the kind of situation where you have existing departments that are trying to fight for their own survival in some cases. And they fear that if anybody else comes in, then they will lose some kind of funding. So in a way, what I would say is you will fight for to teach Romansh literature because it's part of the Swiss background, if you want. But those who teach that will have, 5 students. And they don't want to take the chance of opening the door to other cultures. And they will use the reason that it's not that essential because you can do it elsewhere, or because we have to give priority to something that's more Swiss or whatever. So I think that it's just selfishness on the part of those departments more than anything else. And at the same time, that selfishness serves the university, because it means the university can also say, well, we don't have demands, or we don't have people who volunteer to do it, or it's just a minority, so it doesn't matter and we can just forget it. Or they can say, well, maybe we won't do it, but maybe the university itself cannot offer it. It could be a chapter, it could be a session in something that the Graduate Institute is giving, for instance, because they are open on the world, and they may have a session on African cultures because it's part of also African politics. So it's a way also to pass the hot potato to somebody else, I think. Mm. But for me, it's just selfishness.
And that's very interesting, Luc. Indeed, I think that these dynamics, they can be seen at university, they can be seen in all sorts of communities. This morning, we were discussing how African history is, not only based on orality, as we often hear. Yeah, it's not written, therefore it's hard to get to the source. We explored with Dr. Momesek the fact that, for example, plasticity and art are forms of expression, as well that can be summoned and analyzed if you want to. And obviously, there's some living sources in people, for example, who have been through colonization, independence, for example, to give an example. They can still talk about these very interesting topics. There are ways around the scarcity of a certain specific type of resources, but often what is missing is the will to go and explore. And I've always been really surprised, and I want to ask you if I'm right to be surprised by that, to see that African studies departments are not so often around here led by Africans. What do you think of that?
I would say it's not surprising. Again, I mentioned earlier the people who got the chaire d'études africaines au Collège de France, the Collège de France. Collège de France is a very prestigious organization. The researcher in question, Mr. Fauvel, is fascinating. His love of Africa is impressive. His knowledge is impressive. But it's true that they could have appointed somebody from African descent. They have the choice, and they didn't. So it's a question, I think, of, again, the academic system is not a democratic system. The academic system is a system where you work by people you know. It's your reputation, it's what you've published and where you've published. If you're a professor at La Sorbonne and you have all your French background, having studied there, and you publish in the most prestigious review, you have more access to these positions than somebody that might be brighter, but lives in Senegal, because they maybe won't publish in the same reviews, or they will not have the same echo. We don't have the same kind of network. So that dimension is essential, unfortunately. And I think it explains a lot of these situations where you have people who are in charge of departments and who don't come from that background. At the same time, what I find striking is that, okay, with my Middle Eastern background, and you look at Middle Eastern departments, I think I haven't made a study. What I'm saying now is just my gut feeling, I must say. But my impression is that although you have a large number of these departments that are still run by people who are not from the Middle East, you have more that are run by Middle Eastern than you have African departments run by African people. And that's probably because the Middle East is closer to European history. There are closer ties. They have been for a longer time working together. The history of the Middle East is associated to the history of Europe, even through the Ottoman Empire. And so you have this kind of closer bounds somewhat. And I think, but otherwise, it's a common problem. And if you look at, well, British universities, for instance, the number of departments of Middle Eastern studies that are run by Middle Eastern people is very low in the end.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That could explain also the thirst that you have in us African people to hear our history being told, being shared. This is linked to all of these situations that can generate and that do generate frustration around the question of African history. Ariane, I think you wanted to share a question.
Yes, a question from Estelle Bunya Fomeju, and she's saying, I spoke to teachers who use critical thinking as a remedial tool. They say, we cannot teach everything, otherwise we will be teaching nothing. We cannot teach alternative accounts, but we teach critical thinking, and we hope that with critical thinking, students will go and research alternatives on their own. What do you think about that position?
I think if you take history, it's a kind of subject that is always evolving. We keep finding new things. And it's a subject where if you want to exhaust completely something and go into every details, you'll reach an amount of information that is impossible to manage. I don't see how you can teach the whole history of the whole world to any student unless you teach only history and no other subject for 10 years. And even then, you still would have gaps. So obviously, you have to use critical thinking. You have to put students in a position where they will be able to continue. Ideally, you should make them want to continue, create a desire, and at the same time, give them the tools to make it possible, to make it happen. Mm-hmm. So yes, I would agree with that. To me, the thing is, the more students are autonomous, the more they can start asking their own questions, the farther they will go, the more creative they will be. At the same time, it's going to be a humbling exercise for teachers. Teachers have been used in many circumstances, in many subjects, to be the ones who know. Somebody mentioned theory of knowledge in a comment. For those who are not familiar with the IB, theory of knowledge is some kind of a course in philosophy and critical thinking, if you want. I'm very schematizing here. For some of my colleagues, what makes it difficult to teach that subject is that it's the one subject where they don't know. They have some knowledge that students don't have. But when you ask questions in theory of knowledge about ethics, it's about how you live things, your own experience. And one student could have more experience of life than you do as a teacher. And you have to accept it. All you can say is, I have some tools you don't have. I'm going to share these tools with you. But you're not in a position where you know. Whereas in math, you can say, okay, that's the answer. I know the answer, you don't. But it's difficult for some colleagues to accept that.
Super, thank you very much. We're coming to nearly the end of the session. I'll let Ariane conclude, but before that, I would like to find Alex, who's here with us. Alex Holland from the Aga Khan Academy. I know that your school is very big on African history and also Islamic history. Do you want to tell us a few things about how you go about teaching African history at the Aga Khan Academies? I'm going to unmute you. Are you here?
Oh, there I am. Thanks, Estelle. Yeah, we've got 2 schools on the continent. We have the Aga Khan Academy in Mombasa, in Kenya, and then in Maputo in Mozambique. Bernardo from Mozambique is here somewhere. I'm just looking for him. And Natasha, who works with us in Mombasa, is here as well. We're working as hard as we can to try and really develop African history within the IB program, the International Baccalaureate. So within the middle years program, we are trying to make sure that there is a strong focus, not just on making sure that students have access to understanding of their local region and the continent, but making sure that there is a balance between looking at the challenges, but also looking at the strength of different communities on the continent. I mentioned in the chat that we really try to teach not just the narrative of the Europeans in Africa, but also looking at the civilizations that existed on the continent and that were growing and evolving before the European presence. In fact, we're just about to start the diploma in Mozambique, and one of the things that we're really hoping to do is to try and teach the options that look at pre-colonial Africa, then do a little bit on colonization, but then focus on independence movements and post-colonial Africa. And so the narrative is focused around the African experience and not focused around the Europeans and their narrative within Africa. We're just starting to try and put that course together, so we'll see how it works. Jeremy, yes, Vico is heading our way to Mozambique, yes. So yes, but we have the same challenge as everybody else has, I think, which is lack of resources. We know that the publishing companies won't publish because they don't feel that the numbers are there. And I'm not necessarily sure that's true. I think if the resources were there, more people would teach these topics. And so I think we need to show that. Ellen talked about maybe getting together and trying to put resources together ourselves that we can share, because I think there's a lot of us trying to do this. And the more that we can share things, the better it will be for everybody. So I think that would be a great step forward out of this conference, and if we can make that happen. Sorry, Estelle, you caught me on the hop. So that was
perfect. Thank you.
stream of consciousness rather than a well-considered answer.
Not at all, not at all. No, that was super interesting, actually. I think we need to have more and more voices speaking up about the importance of teaching African history from an African perspective. It's great that the Aga Khan academies are doing the work, because there's such prominent schools in the world of the IB that it's bound to have an impact. So thank you for sharing that, that point of view, Alex. I really appreciate. Proserpina is saying, can you read you have Proserpina's remark, Ariane?
Yes, she's saying, maybe focus on African publishers looking to promote that African voice.
Absolutely, yeah. These ones are not often noticed, but there's definitely a movement, as Ariane would know, of African publishers trying to create Afro-centered materials. So it's worth looking that way too, absolutely. Thank you so much, Luc. Hand back to Ariane, who is the leader of the session, for conclusion.
Okay, thank you again. Thank you again, Luc Hamzavi, for this session. It was really, really, really interesting.